All right, guys, what is up? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. Thank you for tuning into the stream today, whether you are watching me live or watching the recording. Really appreciate you tuning in and supporting the show. If this is your first time watching Office Hours here, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from our users about DFS, about SaberSim, really whatever you guys want to talk about. If you're a regular on the show, I'm sure you've heard all this before, but we get questions here in through YouTube chat or through our Office Hours channel in Slack or through email, support@sabersim.com, about DFS strategy, about how to use SaberSim, about all kinds of stuff here. So if you want to be a part of the conversation, that's what we're hoping for. I want follow-up questions. I want clarifying questions. That's why I'm here live. I want this to be a bit of a two-way street here. But if you'd like to kind of find where a lot of these questions start and join the conversation at kind of the organic level here, the best place to do that is our Slack community. So when this video goes up as a recording to YouTube, it will have a link to join our Slack community. I highly recommend joining up and getting involved. Otherwise, if you'd like to join, feel free to just email us, support@sabersim.com, and we will shoot you a link. Let's see. I host the show every weekday, Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. On Thursdays, we are typically using this time slot for what we're calling strategy sessions, where I'm joined typically by a couple other members of the SaberSim team, and we do a deep dive into a specific DFS concept or sport type or something like that. So let's see. Tomorrow is Thursday, indeed. So I am going to be joined by Matt and Will tomorrow. We're going to be diving into the MLB model, talking about things that the model is taking into account, walking through some improvements we've been making to the model recently, some future improvements that are still to come. We get a lot of questions that are things like, what is the model taking into account? What isn't it? Where can value be added to projections based on that? So we are going to be bringing in those guys to talk a little bit about how the MLB model is put together, how you can use it to add value to your DFS process. So pretty excited about that overall. I think our focus is going to be here through some of these summer months, especially the end of June and July, on a lot of baseball content in those strategy sessions. So if you have some ideas of things that you think would be interesting, baseball or otherwise, feel free to shout them out into the channel or via email or wherever you prefer. We're always interested in hearing what maybe might be the most useful topics for our strategy session is from you guys, because that is who this is intended to serve. So let's see. I guess with all that said, we do have a few past strategy sessions posted up on our YouTube channel. We have some golf content, some NBA playoffs content, some esports and sports betting videos up. Those are all recent. I think those are pretty interesting watches. I know we're still getting a lot of questions about NBA playoff stuff going on, so I've been pumping that video up in particular a little bit. We've got another golf tournament coming up here tomorrow, so if you're planning on playing that, highly recommend checking out the video Max and I did last week about PGA DFS. But let's go ahead and get started here. I do have a couple questions that have come in throughout the day here, a few things to talk about, but not a day where I have too much on my plate overall in terms of questions. So I'll say it again, a great day to shout out a question if you have one, if you've just got something that you want to kind of talk about or a specific topic. If you've been watching a few of these, you are probably familiar that I've got no problem kind of just picking something and talking about it for a little while. So if you've got something that you think would be interesting to talk about, feel free to shout it out. But without much further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into the first question I have here. This did come in through our support email. And let me see. And this question, if you watched me yesterday, is going to probably feel very familiar to you. It's a similar question to what we got yesterday. I want to cover it again today because we're talking, in this case, the question was about baseball, and yesterday we were talking about golf. So there's some subtle differences there. But this is I would say it's almost like a core question that comes up really often And it's on that strategy side. So the question says, for instance, if I'm making 20 max lineups, should I be focusing on a couple of different winning conditions that I'm hoping for and attack those, or should I really spread myself out? And again, we get this question a lot. This comes in pretty often, right? In terms of what does my player exposure and what does my player pool look like? How condensed should I be? How spread out should I be, right? So let's go ahead and pull up the app here, and I'm going to kind of just walk through this again in a similar way I did yesterday, but a little bit differently as it relates to baseball, and maybe we can point out a couple things. So I mentioned yesterday, right, the very first thing that's going to come into play here, and the most important factor in determining what the overall size of your player pool is going to look like and how exposed you are to certain players is smart diversity, right? What smart diversity is doing, I've mentioned this before here, is it is using at a higher value. It's using smaller buckets of simulations for us to generate every individual player's projected points when building every single lineup in your pool, right? So we've got a full range of outcomes for any single player on the slate. Their mean projection is the average of every point value they score in every simulation we have. And the higher smart diversity goes, the smaller the sample of random simulations we use to pick out a player's projection for that given lineup gets, right? This allows us to diversify your lineups. It allows us to create an element of variance or randomness in your lineups while still looking at real possible ranges of outcomes and accounting for players' upside in building your lineups, right? That's really what's so cool about smart diversity. I think it's probably one of the most powerful tools that SaberSim really has to offer overall. So with that said, we are going to apply a default value for smart diversity for different sports and different contest sizes and types that we think is appropriate, which is going to have an impact on your player pool, at least giving you a starting point for how big your player pool is going to be and how exposed you are going to be to certain players that we think is appropriate for a contest. So I think this question is asking for 20 maxes. Let's just assume for the main slate tonight that we're playing 20 max, somewhere in between 10 and 50,000 entries. These are a lot of the kind of just big GPPs that you see on a night-to-night basis. And we can run this, and we'll see what we're going to get out of this. You'll see that smart diversity is high or very high. It's like a 7 at this setting, right? So we have already an expectation that will probably be fairly spread out, right? That's, I think, our expectation. Hitters are more variant than pitchers, so I would expect us to be probably more condensed at pitchers and maybe more spread out at hitters, but it's not always the case. And that will kind of bring me to my next point. So give this a moment here. Okay, so you can see exactly the way our lineups are kind of constructed for the slate tonight. Let me remove or edit some projections here so that we can get rid of our DK message. Okay, and you can see exactly here, we have 38 players in our pool for 20 lineups. We actually have a very condensed pitching pool for tonight for 20 lineups, and fairly condensed at Houston, especially at the top, but relatively, I mean, a lot of the width of our player pool is captured very much so on the hitting side, right? And this is going to give you a starting point, right, that we feel like is appropriate, matches the contest that you are starting with. It's a good way also if you are just getting familiar with new contest types or new sports. If you have been playing single entry and 3 max contests in baseball forever and you are starting to get interested in playing some 150 maxes, can be a difficult place to know immediately what is an appropriate level of exposure to any one given batter. Well, our default smart diversity sliders are going to get you pretty close to that. The question that comes into play here once you've moved past that point is a matter of your level of individual risk tolerance or aversion and your goal for the contests overall. So what I mean by risk tolerance and risk aversion, right? The more exposed you are to any one player, the more risk your lineup portfolio has to that player, right? We have 90% Yordan Alvarez tonight, who is projected very well, but as we often see, his most popular outcome in his range of outcomes is actually 0. right? I think that comes to a surprise to players sometimes. So if he indeed goes out and hits the outcome that happens 22% of the time and has 0 points, that's going to sink 18 of our 20 lineups, more than likely, right? We're shooting for that top finish. So that exposes you to a certain level of risk. If that is concerning to you, if that's something that you would, I mean, obviously we all want to avoid our most exposed player having 0 points, but if that is something that would, I mean, be a extremely negative outcome to you on that given slate, what I would recommend is walking down some of this exposures, maybe to 50 or 30 or wherever you individually land there is kind of up to you, and adjusting. And what you're actually going to see is very, very quickly, the new players are going to be added to the pool to take their spots, right? So now we're not exposed to any one batter more than 50%, but we've widened our player pool to 48 from 35. So we're exposed to a lot more players, right? The caveat to that, I guess, the other side of that is there are a lot of different lineup permutations out there. It is very difficult to build the best lineup, even if you are exposed highly to many of the best plays, especially looking at something like a 20 max lineup, right? 20 lineups can feel like a lot, but it really isn't when you start looking through this. And a player like, I guess we can just keep looking at Alvarez, right? We essentially have, oh, what happened? Why did that go away? I don't know why that filter didn't work. I guess what I'm saying is that you can, the other side of that is that by condensing your player pool, you allow yourself more opportunities at upside. So while we have 100, well, let's see. That's maybe not a good example because we have 100% Houston stacks. Let's take a team that we have maybe less exposure to overall, right? We have 4 overall stacks using a Tampa Bay 3 stack, right? That gives us 4 opportunities for Tampa Bay. And maybe the absolute nuts on the slate tonight ends up being Houston and Tampa Bay. It's very likely that you could play these 4 lineups, enter them, do fine, but be unable to actually capitalize on the totally right roster construction because you were relatively low exposed to Tampa Bay, right? By setting maybe a higher minimum exposure to Tampa Bay. Oh, it doesn't have that many lineups in here. Let's go ahead and do this a different way. Let's see if we can try it like that. Okay, so that works. So we are now condensing our player pool. We're forcing more lineups in with Tampa Bay stacks. We are dialing in on a more singular outcome of both Astros and Rays going off tonight, but exposing ourselves to greater risk, right? And this is kind of the question that you need to ask yourself. So I always think about it personally when I'm thinking about my own kind of level of risk tolerance is thinking about the 2 negative outcomes here. One being your most exposed player lays an egg and has a terrible game, and you lose every lineup that you entered that player in. The other negative outcome being you had the right approach to the slate and didn't give yourself enough opportunities to capitalize on it and probably maybe just min cashed or something like that, or 2x or something like that, or didn't even cash at all, right? If it's a chalkier team like the Astros are probably going to be. That's kind of the question you should be asking yourself. It's that balance. So I think smart diversity gives you a good starting point in kind of assigning an appropriate level of exposure to certain players, but you can condense if you want to play riskier and capitalize on more upside, and you can spread out if you want to play less risky and sacrifice some upside. That is the overall fundamental truth here behind this idea. That's true of every sport. So that is kind of the way I would like to continue framing this conversation. I'm happy to answer this question every time it comes up here on stream, because I think this is a big part of establishing your kind of the DFS identity almost in the way you think about your contest, right? I know there are folks in the community here that play one stack, max it out every single slate, right? And you're giving yourself as many opportunities as possible for when you're right to capitalize on that. I know I've also talked to other users that don't play a single batter over 30% exposure, even in 20 lineups, right? And they're playing very spread out. and they're playing a flatter approach. I would say the last two things on this is this. There are some questions here about your bankroll management strategy. If you are playing riskier, I would be careful with your bankroll. Make sure that you are playing an appropriate amount of your bankroll per slate that allows you to weather the ups and downs of that strategy, because you are not going to have a lot of days where you're min cashing. You're not going to have a lot of days where you're winning back some of your entry fees. You're basically really playing for that full bink or zero outcome. Secondarily, if you are playing a contest that is really top heavy and most of the prizes are to first or to the top 10, I'm thinking of contests like that $5 knuckleball that they ran earlier this week on DraftKings, where I think it was 30% of the prizes to first, 45% or maybe 50% in the top 10, and then like a 1.5x min cash. There's almost really no benefit to playing a contest like that with the goal of doing anything other than trying to win to first. In that particular case, it may make more sense to go in with a more condensed player pool and kind of shoot for the moon, that when you're right, you've given yourself as many opportunities as possible to capitalize on that. So I think I will go ahead and leave that there. I think I've done a decent job summarizing that question. I think this question came in from Adam in our support channel. So Adam, if you're watching live, shout out. Let me know if you're here and if you have any questions or if that was helpful. Otherwise, I'll get you a recording as soon as I hop off. But again, a great question. It's something that really kind of establishes that next step of you're building your lineups on SaberSim, but then what are you doing to add value? What are you doing to kind of make them your own? This is definitely right in that area. So. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead on. I do see a question came in here from Paris on YouTube. He said, continued from yesterday, what does single entry process look like? Thanks. Paris, I did actually, I think this maybe was 2 days ago. I saw your question come in here on the stream and I answered it. I would say, go back. I'll get you maybe a recording. I don't know if you're in our Slack community or somewhere I can send you this. I'll get you a timestamped recording of when I answered this question a couple days ago. The overall summary of my answer here is that the sliders will adjust in a way that is appropriate for the differences and changes between a 20 max and a single entry. You'll see they do not change significantly. And that is indicative of the fact that I think your strategy for building lineups, whether you're playing a single entry or a 20 max contest, do not need to change significantly. So a lot of the same core principles that we talk about in terms of building lineups with upside, lineups that are correlated, lineups that appropriately fade chalk and get leverage on the field are true no matter how many entries you can put into the contest. So there are subtle differences that happen between the sliders and the way that your rosters might be changed between a 20 max and a single entry, but the process for the way that you're building your lineups is not going to be dramatically different. So I did dive a little bit deeper into why that is and just provide a little bit more detail a couple days ago. I think it was Monday's stream. And they are all timestamped on YouTube in the description, so you can find the exact question. Shout me out in Slack if you're in there, and I'll send you a link. But I'm going to go ahead and move us along here. Let's see. I saw another question come in. Don said, in MLB, is there a correlated stat that is more significant than others? That's an interesting question. I'm gonna answer this in kind of the way that I'm immediately thinking about this, a way that I think baseball is somewhat unique in the way we think about correlation, and it's actually in the form of the absence of a stat. The most common correlation that people think of in DFS in general, the thing that immediately pops into your mind is where a player scores and a player scores fantasy points and another player scores fantasy points alongside it directly correlated with it, right? That would be for football, the quarterback throwing the touchdown to the wide receiver, right? They both get points. The quarterback can't catch the touchdown without the wide receiver can't catch the touchdown without the quarterback throwing it. Those players have that correlation in that way. We have some of that in baseball where bases loaded, the 1, 2, 3 hitters all get on base. The four hitter comes in, cleans up, hits a grand slam. You get the on base points for every player that got on, the runs for all those players, the RBI for the hitter, the home run for the hitter, everybody's scoring, right? And that all kind of happens at once. I think one thing that's really important to know when you're thinking about like DFS correlative theory is that, and this is true of other sports too. I'll talk about maybe some other ways this comes up to other sports, but there is opportunity correlation in baseball, primarily because it's not a timed sport, right? So one of the biggest ways that baseball players are actually correlated to each other is when one player gets on base or fails to get out, either by getting a walk or gets a hit or whatever. They actually, in effect, give every other batter in the order 1/9, I guess, of an additional at bat. I don't know if it's actually 1/9, but they give in effect every other player in the batting order another opportunity, right? Because an out was not made. And this can go on as long as it needs to, right? Like baseball games, if one team is hitting after hitting after hitting and they just cannot get anyone out, the game can go 4 or 5 hours, right? There's not really any other sport like that works in that way. Imagine if every time somebody scored a basket in basketball, they added another 10 seconds to the clock or something like that, right? That's where that can happen. And that creates correlation for those players in the form of one player's good day at the plate, good day hitting, is actually likely to correlate with other players' good days at the plate just because they get more opportunity, right? And it has a dramatic effect on players because players don't actually get very many at-bats, right? So if a player is expected to get 4 at-bats or something like that, a fairly standard outing at the plate, right? They have 4 opportunities to score, essentially. If the rest of the team is hitting well and they get an extra at-bat, that is a 25% increase in that player's potential opportunities that day. That's significant, right? Going back to like the basketball analogy, I know it's kind of silly. In that case, it's not as if they put 10 seconds on the clock because somebody scored. It's like as if they put another quarter on the clock. It's a significant change to every individual's it's a significant change to every individual batter's potential outcomes that day when you give them that much additional opportunity. And that's a huge factor in why baseball hitters are correlated. That's also a huge factor in why we want to actually do full stacks. Users definitely notice sometimes, I think, here that these correlation numbers are a little bit lower than you might expect. The effect of these correlation numbers is amplified when Gurriel's correlated with Brantley, who's correlated with Correa, and everybody's correlated together. So that's something that's, I think, is important to think about when you're talking about MLB. I will say our model, since we are simulating all of these games and using correlation coefficients to actually look at how fantasy points are correlated over 5,000 game simulations, takes all of this into account. It takes into account the correlated points of a batter getting a hit that knocks in an RBI and scores a run, as well as the correlative effects of players getting additional at-bats when their other hitters in the lineup get at-bats. So I think that's, I don't know, Don, if that's like more, I don't know if I would say that's more significant than others. I think actually it mathematically is. I think there's a mathematical greater significance to that form of correlation than there is to the more granular like scoring correlation. But that is probably, I think, the best answer I have to that question at the moment, and definitely something that is, it's good to know, and it's interesting. I think I mentioned I might talk about some of the ways this comes up in other sports, and I won't spend too much time on this, but I think one of the ways that this immediately pops into my head is in a sport like basketball, where obviously you have very minor micro correlations between players, where a player that assists a lot, that passes the ball to a teammate and he scores, that those two players maybe are correlated slightly positively over the long run. Where this like opportunity form of correlation really comes into play is in two players that maybe can't share the court at the same time because they play like the exact same role on the team. Two centers, for example, in basketball. If one of those players gets into foul trouble and therefore takes himself out of the game, removes some of his minutes, that creates opportunity for the other player. And in that way, those players are negatively correlated in the same way, right? It's not as if they're negatively correlated like a quarterback is negatively correlated to the opposing team's defense, right? The quarterback scores, the defense's points go down, a very rigid correlation. It is a negative correlation in the form of when one player occupies the court, he removes opportunity from the other, or vice versa. That's another one that comes to mind when thinking about correlations. So there are different kinds of correlations. Again, I guess just in summary here before I move us on, one of the things that is really so cool about SaberSim and the way that we're using real simulation data to develop these correlations is we can take all of those kinds of things into account, boil them down into a number, and go from there, and then build effective lineups that are stacked appropriately. So cool. Yeah, Don said thanks, helps me look at it differently. Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting idea. I can't remember who was probably the first one to explain that to me, but I remember thinking that it kind of blew my mind, thinking about that the first time. And it's definitely an interesting way to look at correlations. So let's see. I don't see any other questions that have come in just yet, so feel free to shout them out if you've got them. I do have something else to talk about, so I will move to the next topic I've got here, and this one came in from Pippin Ain't Easy here via DM. I'll just capture some of this here so we know what we're talking about here. So there was some interesting conversation in our MLB channel in Slack. Just another reason to join the Slack channel if you aren't already in there, about MLB Showdown. I actually think we may end up doing a strategy session here if there's enough to talk about. I think there is. I think MLB Showdowns, there can be a lot of edge in these contests. I think I mentioned it yesterday. Chris at SaberSim has been having a lot of success playing these recently. I don't think people build lineups in a way that is very effective, so I think there's a lot to talk about here. But one of the things you will notice if you are building lineups for Showdown on SaberSim fairly quickly is, I will go ahead and just use something like this, typical Showdown contest. And hopefully we get a couple here, but you're going to get relief pitchers in your lineups. And that comes to a surprise for some people. I think particularly because DraftKings doesn't even really make it very easy to find these players. If you're actually entering lineups on the site or on your phone or whatever, you have to check a box that looks kind of scary and says something like show unprojected players or show players that aren't in the starting lineup. It's definitely not something that the casual player is likely to do. But these players do enter the game. They are actually real baseball players, if you can believe it. And there can be some edge in rostering these players. So you'll see it's typically not a ton of these guys. But if you build 20 or so, and probably more so if you build 150, I don't even know if there's 150 max Showdown contests. I haven't been playing any, but I stick to the 20 maxes a lot. You will see some of these relief pitchers show up in your lineups, right? And we'll say the projected own is typically single digits. It's often much lower than that. A lot of these guys are at most maybe for maybe a closer or a reliever that has a really likely chance of getting in the game, sometimes maybe like 2 or 3%, a lot of times less than that. And I mentioned, again, these players do come in the game. We have simulation data for what they are likely to do when they get in the game. They don't have massive ceilings, but what they do give you on a contest that is boiled down to a single game sample, when their competition is, when their lineup competition, right, players that you could use instead of them, their opportunity cost is mostly hitters, of whom have very low floors, and their chances of scoring 0 are their most likely outcome. They provide an opportunity to get a lot of leverage on the field, right? Because they are going to be very low rostered compared to what they can do. And what you are looking really from rostering a player like this is not that one of these guys is going to go out and get 18 points or something like that, but that one of these guys is going to get in the game, maybe throw through an inning, and racking up 3 outs and maybe a strikeout, or even better. I mean, these guys are talented pitchers. Sometimes they come in and get you 2 or 3 strikeouts, or are a long reliever and play some extra innings or something like that. You're basically just getting a ton of leverage on the field over a player that might have been rostered in their place. So we can look, for example, at a lineup that has a reliever, right? And you are essentially, typically these guys are min price. They're like 4,000. They will take the place of a hitter that is like very, very low salary. So you can see, typically they will take kind of the lineup place of like one of the bottom order guys that is probably going to be pretty chalky. Like I actually played this showdown. Ben Gamble was like 35% owned. He's only 400 more than a reliever. His outcome for scoring 0 is probably by far his most likely outcome. That's kind of the leverage you are trying to get, right? A lineup that is built a certain way. And you could see, let's go back to our Richard Rodriguez lineup. So a lineup that is built this exact way, I don't think we wouldn't be able to afford exactly going up to Gamble. But for the point of looking at this, you can see, right, replacing Rodriguez for some bottom order hitter or something like that is very likely to be a highly duplicated lineup. There's probably a lot of these lineups in there. By sneaking in this relief pitcher, you get access to a player that the field is pretty much likely to completely overlook. So that's kind of the reasoning for why these players show up, right? And again, they won't show up in a ton of your lineups, but they typically will show up in a few if you're building MLB Showdown lineups. Now, how can we add value to this process, right? Matt mentioned in the MLB channel this morning, and that's kind of why this question came up, is that our model right now at the moment doesn't take into account what relievers have pitched recently. Depending on the pitcher, depending on the team, and what that pitcher's role is, there are trends that you can use to find the likelihood of a certain player pitching in that game, right? So I have 2 resources that I like to use for this. I will say 2 things before I go much further. One, I am not a baseball roster expert. I don't think you have to be to do this, but I think if there's somebody watching me here now that is very tuned into baseball bullpens, I apologize if I say something that isn't actually exactly correct in terms of these individual players' roles on the team, right? And secondarily, this is something that is going to require a little bit of manual work. I think you can add a lot of value here. I think you can tighten up your exposures even more. I think first, you're going to get a ton of leverage on the field just by allowing some relief pitchers into your roster. But of course, those guys may not come into the game, and you can probably add a little bit of additional value by identifying opportunities of guys that maybe have a greater chance of coming into the game. So one of the tools I really like to use the most is this I like how simple this site is, but baseballpress.com, they have this baseball usage table, and they will show basically how many pitches everybody in the bullpen for every team in the league has thrown in the last 5 days, right? So it is Wednesday here. So what is weird, I believe the organization of the table seems actually a little weird to me today. Tuesday, Monday, Sunday, Saturday, Friday. Okay, got it. So it's going backwards. So it's yesterday's, the day before, Sunday, Saturday, Friday. So today would be kind of right here, right? And it shows you how many pitches they threw in the last 5 days, right? And then secondarily, the other tool I like to use is this RotoTramp site. I just like them because they're relatively simple. They get the information really quick. There's probably other or better places to do this. But what they'll do, and I'm looking at Pittsburgh here because that's the game we're looking at, is for somebody that doesn't really know bullpens very well, they will kind of identify who's the closer, who's the setup guys, and then who are the middle relievers. And you can use these 2 things in conjunction to add a little bit of additional value. So let's go find the Pirates. And I guess what I am particularly looking for is I'm looking to eliminate pitchers that threw recently or the day before in particular that typically are not allowed to throw multiple days in a row or typically don't have the trends of throwing multiple days in a row. So right off the bat, players that are closers, generally, I think most teams in the league, they will allow their closer to throw 2, maybe even 3 games in a row sometimes if they have a save situation that requires them to come into the game. So for Richard Rodriguez, right, you can see this. He throws Friday, he throws Saturday, doesn't throw Sunday, doesn't throw Monday, but then throws Tuesday. And I don't know what the current score of this game is or if this is even going to present for a save opportunity for Richard Rodriguez. But it's a player I'd probably be willing to keep in my lineups. And I'm generally okay with rostering the closers just because I feel like if they have that save opportunity coming up, even if they've pitched recently, they are probably likely to be allowed to pitch again. You can sometimes see some teams give save opportunities to other players, especially the setup guys. But a lot of times they will pitch that closer again if he has a save opportunity. Secondarily, I guess then the next thing that I'm looking at is players that pitched the day before that typically don't often pitch multiple days in a row. So you can see here, I guess let's look at the guys we're actually getting in our lineup. So we got one lineup with Bednar, and it does get a little difficult to see this, right? Like you got to make some educated guesses here. This is a guy that they allowed to pitch 5 pitches and then 11 pitches, and he pitched yesterday for 8. You can look, and he is just a reliever. He's a middle reliever. It might be a candidate of a pitcher that you could remove from your pool with kind of the bet that he's not going to be allowed to pitch again. And that didn't actually pop another reliever into our lineup here. So we just now have the one Richard Rodriguez lineup. But let's go ahead and try it for another build. Let's do the San Francisco and LA game coming up here. I know LA is sometimes a little cautious with Ohtani. So let's see if we get any relievers here. So again, what I'm basically looking for is I'm looking to see if I can narrow down the relief pitcher pool that I'm willing to use by removing pitchers that pitched recently, or definitely if they pitched multiple games in a row, that often are not allowed to do so. And as you're going through this, you'll actually get a little bit more familiar with what bullpens for certain teams look like and who are some of these guys that get to pitch a little bit more, how much certain teams rely on their bullpens more than others. This can actually have pretty interesting impacts on your main slate play once you get a little bit more familiar with teams' bullpens. But we'll give this a second to run and just see what we're getting out of this. So I guess what I should do is maybe we can look at the Angels. Maybe we'll get some Angels relievers in here. All right, let's see if we got any here. Okay, so we did get a few. So we've got 2 guys. We've got Cishek and Iglesias, right? So we can do the same thing here, right? Let's get an idea. So Iglesias again pops up. He's their closer. And that's often the kind of player that's going to come in here because, you know, in our simulation data, we will reflect the fact that he has a lot of game outcomes where he gets an opportunity to pitch. And Cishek, this site's got him in the minors. So they maybe need to update that. But then let's go ahead and look over here. So he didn't pitch yesterday. He didn't pitch Monday. I think that's a pitcher that maybe is a candidate to keep in the lineup, right? So maybe might be worth double checking that he's actually here. Let's see. But probably somebody that maybe doesn't need to be crossed off, right? So it can provide a little bit more opportunity for research for you. You can add some value to this step. You can, we also have Myers, Mike Myers. So same deal, right? And somebody that actually pitches quite a bit more, right? Probably spends maybe a little bit more of a longer reliever type role on this team, right? Gets to pitch a little bit more. That's another indication you can use, right? A player that pitches more often or throws more pitches when they go out provides you a little bit more upside. So I'm definitely probably okay with somebody like Myers who's getting a lot of pitches when he's out there and hasn't pitched the last 2 days to stay in your lineup, right? You have 15% of them here with this build. That's probably a risk tolerance thing. Maybe you're okay with that. Maybe you're not. You're going to have quite a bit of leverage over the field with even just 3 lineups out of 20 that have that player in them if he comes into the game. That's reflected again in you can see his range of outcomes, right? He has probably just a much greater chance of getting into the game period here. So that I think is kind of a good place to stop there. That's kind of my overview of how I like to do this and how I like to look at things with the relief pitchers. Again, I think there's a lot of edge in Showdown. I think a lot of the edge is in building a unique lineup, and having almost any relief pitcher in your lineup almost drops the odds of that lineup being duplicated to 0. It's just, I mean, it's obviously still possible. It just, with how rarely these players are rostered, like this is not 15%, 12%, 10%. This is just not how rostered those players are going to be. The way our projected ownership works for the purposes of MLB Showdown, this is almost more of like an implied ownership, implied ownership, meaning this is almost like saying this is like the ideal ownership for some of these players, right? This is how much we would expect the field if they were appropriately valuing these players to use them. And under that light, you can see our exposures to them make a lot more sense. And it definitely, you are justified in using them, even more so considering how little the field is using them, right? We even get that additional leverage. So definitely recommend trying that out. I recommend trying out MLB Showdowns. I've been having a lot of success with it this season too. I don't think we need to be afraid. I think we should embrace the use of relief pitchers in our Showdown lineups. And this is kind of a good way to do that and also add a little value along the way. So in summary, don't be afraid of the relief pitchers. You can use these tools to see, one, what pitchers have pitched recently, which pitchers get to pitch a lot when they're out there. And then I guess secondarily to both of those things, which pitchers are allowed to pitch in multiple games in a row, and how often are they allowed to do so. So cool. Let me know if anyone has any questions on that. And I will go ahead. I see another question came in here. This is a question from Jack. In response to my discussion about percentiles yesterday. So let me see. Let me give a minute here to read this. So building on yesterday's percentile convo, obviously we know median projections don't mean much for MLB, and therefore value at the median matters less than NBA for an extreme example. But should value at ceiling outcomes be something considered heavily when breaking down a slate? I think San Francisco and Detroit from today's early slate is an example of ceiling versus value at the ceiling. Yeah, so when we start talking about value, one of the things that I mentioned yesterday was absent from my entire conversation about percentiles was basically ignoring salary, right? And that's how value ends up being determined. I basically just assumed that there weren't salaries at all, and really just looked at absolute ceilings. We can take a look at this here. I'm happy to talk about this a little bit. Jack, if you're watching this, eerily reads like a question that I get on here where the person asking the question has some idea of their how they would answer the question. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of start talking about this. Feel free to chime back in if you have thoughts to add here. I'll pull it up on screen. You've had the advantage over me of being already thinking about this question. I think this is probably a little bit more on that advanced side topic too. So if you have thoughts and you're watching along, feel free to hop into the conversation. But essentially what we did yesterday, and if you didn't watch it, I'm going to just assume you did. So if you didn't, go check back to the previous day's video. I think I timestamped it for when I was talking about these percentiles. But really what I pointed out was that teams become inefficiently owned more significantly because there is ceilings meet the ceiling outcomes for teams kind of condense at a similar number, and even the highest projected team on a slate often has a ceiling that is closer to the lowest projected team on the slate than their median outcomes do. So basically, I guess kind of to follow that up, most DFS players build lineups based on mean or median projected outcomes, where the difference between the highest projected team and the lowest projected team are most extreme, but also at the outcome that matters the least to us as tournament players, right? So again, that's kind of a very quick one-liner summary. I would recommend checking out that video from yesterday, maybe after the stream here. Don't go all running away from me now. But anyway, so what Jack is saying is how does value kind of play into this, right? Because salary is actually a thing. We can't roster everybody. We have to pick value plays and try to get the best bang for our buck. And he said, I think San Francisco and Detroit from today's early slate. Let's go look at the early. Is an interesting example of ceiling versus value at the ceiling. So let's go ahead and look at our 85th percentile here, and just look at how these teams kind of score out. So you had mentioned San Francisco and Detroit. So let's compare maybe a handful of teams here, and maybe I can kind of figure out what the best way to discuss this is. Let's do batters first of all. So San Francisco's hover around those middle three values. Detroit, right, significant values comparatively. And then like a team like Washington, even more so. I mean, I'm going to answer this honestly, Jack, in the way that like okay, here's what's coming to mind for me. Because players are going to use optimizers that are essentially trying to solve the knapsack problem, is like the problem in computer science, right? How much, if you are limited by something, in this case, a salary cap, how much of the thing can you put into a set? That's what kind of a traditional optimizer is going to do. So it's going to try to take as much fantasy points as the thing, put it into the set, the lineup, while staying under a certain restriction. Okay, he says, I'm here. I'll DM you later to discuss. All right, I'm going to take a stab at this anyway. You put as much of the fantasy points in the lineup while staying under the salary cap, right? That's how most fantasy optimizers are going to work. And I think this is true really even at a variety of different percentiles. And it's another way of looking at it, right? Teams that I mentioned yesterday, I did this from the form of ceiling and implied run totals. And I think the point, or the thing that's immediately coming to mind here for me, is that you can do a similar thing with value, right? And they're really almost two sides of the same coin. But players are also going to gravitate, as in the same way that they gravitate towards stacks of teams that are highly projected or projected really highly. They're going to gravitate towards teams that also point per dollar are projected very highly, even if those players individually don't have a much higher ceiling than their counterparts, right? So I think, again, Jack, I'll catch up with you later, and maybe I'll follow up with this in a future office hours, but I think this is still interesting to show. And looking at the two teams Jack mentioned here, right, San Francisco and Detroit, we'll go ahead and go back to an 85th percentile. These two teams have a 4.5 and a 4.9 implied run total. They're probably going to have a fairly similar ceiling outcome, right? You can kind of see it here. So we have Yastrzemski here. I hope I pronounced that right. He's projected a little higher. He's kind of one of those high dollar guys. But then you can see really the main stacks of these guys all have the same outcomes, right? But if we look at value, it's enormously dominated by Detroit. What this indicates to me, and I'm curious if Jack has a different maybe approach here, is that teams are going to gravitate more heavily to Detroit in this case, despite these teams having essentially the same ceiling, because they fit in better when you're trying to solve the knapsack problem with a traditional optimizer. So I think there is an opportunity for us to get a little bit of additional edge and leverage on it on the field by flipping the script and playing the team that has the probably lower ownership, slightly less point per dollar value, but in an equivalent ceiling outcome, given the two opportunities, right? Let's look at the main slate tonight and see if we can do this in a little bit more future-focused way, right? So I'm just looking at this slate for the first time. It looks like we have Houston Mega Chalk again tonight. So what you have probably learned here, if you watched yesterday, right, is that Houston is likely to be Mega Chalk tonight, right? 6.0 implied run total. But when we switch to the 85th percentile, we're looking at ceilings. We see that it's not entirely dominated by Houston. There are teams and stacks that are going to come up that are going to have a very similar ceiling or just slightly less that are going to come in a way lower ownership. Where I think this kind of gets interesting looking at then value, where you can add a little bit of additional value, is looking at kind of what some of those value stacks start to look like, especially as you're comparing second choices, right? So let's say we're going to remove Houston and look at some of these next best choices, right? Teams like the Yankees, Atlanta, Oakland, and KC, right? So let's just look at those teams. And the Yankees, right? Oh, the Yankees are actually probably going to be fairly chalky tonight too. And we could start looking at what teams fit very nicely into lineups, right? A team that immediately pops out to me is Kansas City. Kansas City does not have a very high implied run total. They're one of those next secondary stacks, but I think they themselves too are likely to get put into a lot of lineups. Their ownership is probably likely to be a little bit higher than some of the other teams that have a similar ceiling because they have enormous values, and you could probably even do this at the average percentile and grade out, and it's going to be similar, grade out point per dollar really well. They're very convenient for lineups to be built around. A lot of lineups are probably going to use them. And again, the whole point here is that the ceilings of these players, what actually happens at the range of outcomes that wins you the tournament, don't really differ. So a team like Oakland here that I think is not going to grade out particularly well point per dollar, is not maybe going to be one of the elite top plays that a lot of teams gravitate towards, has a good chance of going under-owned compared to their relative ceiling compared to the rest of the field because of those two things. So, Jack, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. We can chat later too, but I mean, if that was kind of the direction you were taking that question, I'm curious. If it wasn't, if you have like a different way of looking at that, I'd also be curious about that. That's kind of what popped into my head. I think that's a good point, but it's kind of flipping the script in terms of what like traditional DFS thought might be, where you're playing the teams that have elite value. That's what most optimizers are going to do, right? The point per dollar value. But when we're optimizing for upside, we're not so interested in looking at that. So, I mean, and when we're thinking about like ways that we can actually start to incorporate this into our process, right? I think one of the most interesting things you can do is just take some of this with you into your test build. So I think one thing we've identified here now just doing this is Houston and the Yankees pop up as candidates that are likely to be highly owned, I think, particularly Houston because of their run expectation. We can compare that to the Vegas board, right? Let's see. Does Vegas like the Yankees too? Yeah, they do, right? So I think those are likely to be very popular teams. I think KC is likely to be sneakily somewhat popular in that second range because they are so affordable. So then what we can do here, oh, I didn't want to exclude. Let's just put everyone back into our filter and run a test build here. I'm going to put it at medium projection too, just so we're like totally starting from scratch test build. and let's see what we get. And you can use this to maybe influence your lineups. So maybe depending on what kind of contest you're playing, depending on how top heavy there are, maybe Houston and New York and KC are teams that we want to be cautious with because of how convenient they are to be played in lineups overall. So let's just see what we get out of this. Paris, I see your question too. I won't leave you hanging. We getting close to the end of the show again today here. They always fly by. Excuse me. Choked on my words there. Okay. All right. I'm going to All right. Barely making it through the last 5 minutes of my stream today. Holy smokes. I choked on nothing, actually, is what I choked on. So, okay. So what I was saying is I want to be a little bit cautious about Houston, KC, and New York here, given what we've just discovered, the things we're putting together about looking at percentiles and value and ceilings for the last couple days. And right now, SaberSim really likes Houston. Does that mean you need to run the exact opposite direction and fade them completely? It's an option. You don't have to do that. You can start to look at what your lineups are actually looking like and see if you are getting really different elsewhere. You also can look at what your contests look like. This is a fairly big contest at a 20 max, where I would expect to fade a little bit more chalk, but you can see in this particular lineup, we're using some Tampa Bay. Excuse me, I'm sorry. But that is likely to be a little less chalky. But it's a signal of maybe something to investigate a little bit more. You see, so we have some Mets here. So we have smaller chalky stacks. But maybe you take a approach that is different than what the field is going to do based on what we've learned the last couple days. Maybe that's a fade. Maybe that's a mediated approach to fading. Maybe that's making sure you don't have any small stacks of Houston, which it looks like we don't. But maybe we take this down. Maybe we fade them. Let's just say, for example, right? And you can see who immediately pops up. I saw it a second ago, KC. Maybe we don't play any KC. I'm just using this as an example, guys, right? Because I think teams are going to conveniently get to KC too. And we have one Yankee stack. Maybe we cross them off the list too. And now we're going to take approaches to teams that, again, probably have similar ceilings at that high end that are going to be pretty unique, right? Teams aren't going to get to Tampa Bay and Atlanta and Baltimore very easy tonight. They're not going to do very much of that, at least. And those teams grade out. Again, I think Tampa Bay, they do have Wander, who's likely to be himself very chalky. But from what we've been seeing, right, the last couple days talking about this, it's just unlikely that teams are going to get to some of these other stacks so we can get leverage on the field there. So anyway, I will stop talking about that so much. Again, this is kind of a continuation on a theme we were talking about yesterday with percentiles and ceilings. So I would recommend going back and watching that yesterday's session if you haven't seen it already. It will make a lot more sense if you have. I'm going to try to hit some of these last questions here quickly. We'll go a little bit over on time here because I want to make sure I talk about this. So Paris asked, do you prefer to play single entry or do you like to max entry? I will once again plug this. Let's see. Oops. I'm all out of sorts now. This course that Andy worked on, it is under resources in strategy in baseball, under course. The second lesson here, or really the first real lesson, is about bankroll management and contest selection. It's 22 minutes long. Andy talks about the exact kind of contest that he recommends playing based on what Paris said. Sorry, Jordan, was my question that bad? Oh, about me choking. Yeah, I guess so. I think what it was is my body telling me, hey, get off your soapbox and answer some of these other questions that are in the queue here. So anyway, I would recommend watching this video. He's going to be able to go into more detail about the exact contest we recommend for people to build their bankroll based on entry fee limits, effective entrance, how many players can actually max out a contest, and so on. Contests like the Mini Max and one, some of these other contests actually can be deceptively very difficult contests to win. So I would say in general, I highly recommend playing the single entry contests at your price point first before you max enter, because they are often going to come with fairly softer fields, especially if they have over 1,000 entrants or so like that in it. That is often my approach overall to my contest selection. I like having a lineup portfolio overall. I like max entering. I like thinking about my exposure to players over a wider sample and saying that I am 2 times relative to the field in my exposures, which is something that the more lineups you have, the more opportunity you can do that, rather than just having like a binary, I'm playing the player or I'm not. So I use single entry contests as a part of my overall lineup portfolio on a slate. I play a lot of max enter 20 and 150 maxes as well. But I recommend if you are kind of just getting started, trying to build out your bankroll, maybe even just getting familiar with SaberSim, the single entry contests at any given price point are almost always way softer than the max entered contests or the multi-entry contests. So that's how I would answer that. But I would recommend this video is so good. Like, it really is. I mean, it's just a really good video. The whole course is awesome. I recommend this course to people all the time. But this video, if you're just going to watch one, is really good. So highly recommend that. And then wrapping up here, Jeff asked, why isn't there a Dota sim? The answer is because we take our sims very seriously. We work hard on our models, and we are not going to put a model out there that isn't something we stand behind and would use ourselves. So we have been hearing a little bit of requests for Dota. We've been hearing requests for Valorant. I know even on the other side, people are asking for NASCAR projections, WNBA, right? There are a lot of other sports you can play on DraftKings. We want to get to these. We want to continue to add to our sports offering, but we are not going to put a model out there that we don't believe in, that we don't stand behind, that we haven't worked diligently to create and backtest and really put a quality product out there, just like we feel like the rest of our major sport models are. So it's on our radar. Unfortunately, I don't have like an estimated time for when we would expect to be able to put some work into that. We're pushing pretty hard on some initiatives right now that we really want in time for football season. I also think DraftKings is sending a little bit mixed signals about what their expectations are for their Dota product right now. I know there are some big contests this week. I don't know if they overlaid or not, but I am hoping that esports continues to grow and that the Dota product at DraftKings and DFS continues to grow. But I think it has been a little rough out of the gate. So once maybe there's a little bit more invested in a little more time behind that, we can kind of start to invest some of the time of our own here to build out a model. If you play CSGO or League of Legends and use our models for those sports, you will probably come to find quickly that they are very good. Will and Max have worked very hard on those. They take a lot of work to put into them, and we publish them when we feel like we have a really strong product. So Jeff said, cool indeed. That's what's up. All right, guys, I managed to get through the end of my show here without choking again. Thank you all for tuning in. Hopefully this was a good show today here. I had fun, as I do every single day doing this. Continue to build off these here piece by piece. I think there's kind of a story here overall coming together about our DFS process as we work through this here together. About, we talked a lot about editing projections, adding value there. We've been talking recently about using percentiles and things like that to find some of our leverage on the field. There's been a lot of questions about crafting our player pool, setting our exposures, right? Getting that right balance of risk and upside. I'm here every day, so I kind of start to feel this general theme or story of improving your DFS process happening here day by day. But hopefully you guys do too. If you're watching these regularly, I recommend it. Obviously, checking these out every day. I think they're useful. The more that you get to watch these, and that's not just because I'm sitting up here talking, but it's because questions. I answer a question one day about percentiles, and it changes the way I think about this the next day, and we continue to build on things and grow and get a little bit better every day here. So anyway, I'll let everyone get back to their afternoons here. We'll wrap up. We are coming right back again tomorrow. It will be 2 p.m. Eastern again, but instead of office hours, again, we're doing a strategy session about the baseball model overall. Matt and Will be joining me to talk about the model, what it's taking into account, things we're working on to improve it and get better. And then we'll be right back with office hours again on Friday. And I will see you guys there. So if you have any questions, final thought here, if you have any questions about the baseball model that you would like to have answered by us live on stream or something that you'd like us to talk about, email us support@sabersim.com or pop it into the office hours channel in Slack. We'll make sure we talk about it on stream tomorrow. I know you guys have questions because I see them come in a lot. So if you have thoughts or things you want answered by Matt or Will tomorrow about the baseball model, please fire them off and let's really put them through it. Let's give them some tough questions. So anyway, it was a lot of fun. I will see you guys tomorrow. And until then, take care. See ya.